Hello, everyone. Hi. My name is Mickey. I'm the Business of Music Manager here at the Music District. You are at the keynote of Art Up Week, which is the partner track of events from Fort Collins Startup Week. Really quickly, just a couple of things. This space closes at 10, so afterwards feel free to hang out, chat, eat all of those cookies. I don't want to eat them all later, so please do that. And make yourselves at home. If this is your first time here at the Music District, welcome. We'd love for you to find your way back in the future. Talk to anybody who has a Music District shirt and me about other things coming up at the Music District. We'd love to see you again. Just really quickly, I want to thank everybody who made this event possible. I'm really looking forward to this talk, and I want to thank all the Music District staff for all their help in putting all of this together. Nick Armstrong, who is the best and organized Fort Collins Startup Week. Along with a really awesome team of planners who come from a variety of backgrounds, which I think allowed us to create a really cool, diverse, kind of far-reaching startup week this week that I'm really proud to be a part of. And then finally, I just want to really thank Gregg and Kit. Gregg, thanks so much for coming. We hope we do this again. And then Kit, thank you for everything you've done to put this together. And I'm now going to turn it over to Kit to introduce Gregg.
Right, so first of all, I wanted to thank some people. I wanted to thank Ty Smith and Tiffany Kelly from the Native American Cultural Center at CSU. They really helped make this possible, and what is really special is that they also were working on an exhibition of Gregg's work at the Duheza Gallery in the Lawyer Student Center. So we had a really rare opportunity to see a performance and also see a really good kind of variety of Gregg's work. So it's great, but it's also really important to see that to really get a sense of the range of Gregg's work, which is really extraordinary. So I hope you're going to go and see that. I'd also like to thank the Music District, and their enthusiastic support really made this possible. It wouldn't have happened without them, so that's great. And also, finally, I wanted to thank John Lukovic, who's the Andrew W. Mellon Curator of Native Arts at the Denver Art Museum. He invited Gregg to a residency at the Denver Art Museum in 2015. And that was really a big part in Gregg deciding to move to Colorado, bring his family, and that's kind of the reason you're sitting here now. So thank you, John, for your foresight. I didn't know he was going to move here. It's too late now. Yeah, and so I just wanted to say a few words about Gregg's work. Some people describe the experience you have when you're face-to-face with a work of art and it's having a really powerful effect on you. Some people say it's the shock of the new. Other people describe as sort of an existential vulnerability, a feeling of, being stripped away to your essential human nature and having it exposed in a unique way. And that's what Gregg's work does. And he does it through really juxtaposing text and image and color and pattern in ways that are really startling. And he's been doing this for about a year in a specific series called The Others, in which he reappropriates comic book images of Indians from the 40s and 50s, and then recontextualizes them with punk lyrics from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, which really kind of formed who he is now as an artist. And so that's what you're going to see tonight, as sort of a performance that grew out of this really intense work that he's been doing. Well, I'll let him go on. I'm very excited. This is an extraordinary opportunity. You will be the first people to see this, and I hope you enjoy it. I'm sure you will. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Gregg Deal's The Punk Pan-Indian Romantic Comedy.
Just a couple of quick words. First off, thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm happy to see so many faces. This is a little different than what I've done in the past. I'm known for doing performance art. This is a cross between performance art and a keynote speaking address, storytelling, with a lot of visuals and integrating music. I've not done this before, and I've not done it in this way. And so I'm really excited to share it with you guys, and I'm glad that you're here. So give me one moment, and then we'll get started. What do I have to prove to you? That I'm a real native person. Do I need to hit a drum? Do I need to wear braids? Sometimes I wear braids, sometimes I don't. How do I reconcile my own sense of self, my own sense of identity in a world that requires my identity to be informed by somebody who's not me? My identity is informed by the perception of others. Do you look Indian? How much Indian are you? These are all fallacies. These are fallacies within my work. How do I assert my own identity in a place and in a time and in a position where I'm not allowed to assert my own identity? I do it through art. Art that is about invisibility, art that is about duality, art that is about stereotype, art that is about divinity, art that is about positive reflection, art that is about the intersection of culture, and art that is also about the recognition of the inequity of our homelands. The difficulty for Americans to understand the existence of Indigenous people is based on how much information that you have about us. My truth comes through art, but how do we reconcile our existence within the devices that have been created in a post-colonial society? It's really easy for people to look at somebody like me or any Native person and say, you're a Native person. I've once had somebody ask me if I still lived in a teepee. These are things that exist because of how informed the world is in what we're doing and how we're doing it. And the duality of our existence, that I can both be Native and that I can also be an American and I can also be a human being and I can also be a punk rocker or a hip hopper or anything else I decide to be, is something that is still true. Because as we try to reconcile our own identity in the limited ways that we have to do it, because we don't have ways that are healthy for us to reconcile who we are, where we're from, where we came from, the trauma of our people, those tools don't exist. And so we rely on the things that are in front of us. For me, that was punk, and that was hip hop. But the lyrics that exist in punk resonate. They have come to define and help me articulate what it is I feel and what it is that I'm trying to say. And that doesn't make sense to some people. My hair's not spiked, my hair's braided. It's long, It's been long for a long time. It's been long multiple times in my life. It's also been short multiple times in my life. But I'm still an Indigenous person. I'm still an Indian. And so what happens? Am I claiming this identity that sits amidst my identity? Am I angry and therefore listen to punk music? Or am I angry because I listen to punk music? It doesn't really matter because it all resonates. The words that leave my mouth are my words, and only my words. The stories I tell are my stories, and only my stories. I've been an Indigenous person my entire life. Things weren't always easy. Sometimes they were tough. There was good things, and then there was tough things. Not everybody gets to grow up looking like this. I grew up in a home. I had a mom and a dad. And my mom and dad were working class. My father was a car mechanic. My mom drove a school bus and did some other odd jobs and things. I remember having enough that I needed, but never having extra. My father once told me, because I grew up in a rich ski resort town in Utah, my father didn't understand why I needed name brand clothes. It was to fit in, so you're not so much of a target. And my dad said, you want your own school clothes and get off your ass and get a job. And so I did. I was 12 and bought my own school clothes. And that's okay, You learn how to be resilient. You learn how to work hard. You learn to work for what you want or what you have. I remember there being a lot of sadness in my life growing up. Depression runs in my family. My father had it. It is really debilitating. It skipped me. I don't have depression. I've never had depression. And yet, I remember being sad. I remember wishing when I was in middle school that I could have somebody love me and that I could feel wanted and loved. I think that speaks to the gravity of how I grew up and the circumstances under which I grew up. I also remember fear. I remember being afraid of everything. I was afraid of my dad, and I was afraid of bullies. When I was in middle school, there was this kid. He was the scariest damn kid I'd ever seen in my life. He just had crazy eyes. I'd never seen anything like that before. And I remember the first time I ever saw a person get punched in the face by another person was because of this kid. And I witnessed that, and it's shocking the first time you see that. And in fact, I remember he took a full can of soda and he threw it at the head of a friend of mine, almost knocking him out. This kid was so freaking violent. And he never bullied me, he never gave me a hard time, but I was scared to death of him. I also remember that he went on a joyride with some friends one night in a pickup truck, and he was in the back of the pickup truck, and they crashed and rolled it. And he was in the accident. They said there was tire marks on his chest, and he went into a coma, and he never recovered. And everybody talked about how incredible he was, what a loss it was. And I know I wasn't the only one that was secretly glad that he was out of the picture. But that's fear. That's what fear does. You take that fear and you take that sadness. And I remember that my father had received a .22 pistol from his dad. My dad grew up in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And they're basically a bunch of rednecks. And he gave him this old .22 to give to me, which I never got. But I knew where my dad kept it. And I remember when I was young, getting some bullets and going up into that room my dad's room into his side table, and I remember loading that gun, and I remember sticking that thing in my mouth. And I remember tears running down my face as I contemplated how sad I was and how fearful I was and how difficult everything was. I had never told anybody that before. I also remember the first time I heard Black Flag. It sounds like noise to some people, but it sounded like a chorus of angels to me. And for a moment, I pushed away the fear. I abandoned the sadness. And I just was all about that. It defined me. It helped me be something that I didn't know that I could be. And I knew the first time I heard that song that my life had been saved. I was always a bit of a mama's boy. My mom was funny. She's where I get my Indian blood from. She's had a lot of trauma in her life. She was always into music, some good music. She was always more into the pop music. You know, David Bowie, Young Americans is the song that she kind of says reminds her of me when I was a kid. I grew up hearing Prince and Wham and Tears for Fears and Hall & Oates. I secretly like Hall & Oates. Michael Jackson, Crowded House. I mean, you name it. My mom was into good 80s pop music, 70s and 80s pop music. And it was a weird family dynamic because we were also a heavy Christian home. And while my mom was okay with the very sexual lyrics of Prince, I wasn't allowed to watch He-Man or play Dungeons and Dragons because those things were evil. And it was this really strange dynamic because at the same time as all of this was happening, my mom was really into the Rocky Horror Picture Show. What? So I grew up not watching He-Man. I grew up not being able to play Dungeons and Dragons, but I knew who Dr. Frankenfurter was, which is simultaneously cool and confusing. My dad's music, my dad was an old hippie, was kind of different than my mom. He really was into like Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. He really liked Neil Young a lot. He liked the band. Yes, Bob Dylan, Doobie Brothers, Steppenwolf, although my mom claims she liked Steppenwolf too, and the Grateful Dead. You know, it's funny because I know my mom was influential for me in music, but my dad, I think, was more influential to me. And his music was always present when we go camping. Those were our summer vacations. We go camping in the desert, Utah, and we would always listen to his music. And I knew that that was always present. And there wasn't ever really a connection to that. My dad was 19 when I was born. He was a car mechanic. I think he liked fixing things, but I think he hated how his hands were always dirty. I think he hated the way that customers would talk to him like he was stupid. He was one of the smartest dudes I've ever known. He went to night school to learn German so that he could read the car parts for the Volkswagens and Porsches that he worked on. Who does that? That's insane. And despite being evangelical and religious in nature, a southern strict parent with discipline, for those of you who are from the South, you know exactly what I'm talking about. He was also decidedly liberal and progressive, and by all intents and purposes, understanding how important equality was. Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, in their first album, I'm trying to remember what it is. Far Away, I believe is what it is. It's a protest album. I actually heard a story by Graham Nash, one of the members, where he was talking about how they had a song that was on the charts that was rising and it was becoming exciting. And as that happened, there were shootings in Ohio at a college, and 4 kids were killed. And Neil Young, this is the most hippie thing I've ever heard, went into the forest and wrote a song and came out with this song, Ohio. And this, to me, was the first song that I can remember that I really connected with. And now, as an adult, it dawns on me that it's a protest song, and how incredibly right it is that the song that makes an impression on me as a youth is a protest song, as I work in protest, as I am an activist, as I am thinking about these things all the time. And this is a gift that I feel like that my father gave me. I work hard as an artist. My aesthetic is sort of punk. It's anti-racist, anti-homophobic, anti-transphobic. The ideology of equality and love while wanting to punch somebody in the face. I mean, that's the delivery. Punk is like basically these anti-Reagan kids that wanted change. Kids who didn't have a war, who didn't have a cause, so they made up their own causes. We made up our own causes. We figured out what was wrong and tried to make changes. My work is unapologetically Indigenous. It's filled with both anger and kindness, wanting to blow it all up, but also wanting to create something beautiful. It is about all of these things. These are the aesthetics. You know, in 2016, I got a chance to do something with the Smithsonian. And I was part of this group show. It was about 40 plus artists. And they had a problem with 2 of the artists. They actually wanted to know what each artist was doing. And when they were going through that process, the lead curator for this show showed them my work, and they kind of freaked out. They gave me a bunch of things that I couldn't say. So they were like preemptively censoring me. As an Indigenous person who grew up in Washington, D.C., I had the privilege of being part of this mascot debate, this concept of stereotype and appropriation, and had an opportunity to really begin to form all of the ideas that come around that. And in this show, having lived in D.C. for 17 years, the Smithsonian said I wasn't allowed to talk about the Washington Redskins. And they said I wasn't allowed to say the word Redskin, and that I wasn't allowed to use their insignia or make any reference to it at all. My original concept didn't involve any of that. My original concept was essentially a teepee filled with IKEA furniture, a comment to modern Indigenous living. But I found that they were so afraid of what I was going to say and what I was going to do that they began to censor my work, and they began to tell me what I could and couldn't do. And that if I did those things, I'd be in breach of contract. And the 10 grand or so that I put into this would not be reimbursed. Starving artists with a lot of children, that's a lot of money. And so you have to navigate, and you have to navigate these power structures. So the first thing I did after I legitimately screamed out loud about the Washington football team bit is I made a painting that said I'm not allowed to talk about the Washington Redskins. And then I took a chisel and I scraped the word redskin off. You could still see what it said, but it technically wasn't there. Because I don't care. I mean, I care, but I don't care. This is the aesthetic. This is the message that I want to send out there. Do I want to be in fear of these things and fall in line? I've done that before. It kind of sucks. I mean, it works for some people. It doesn't really work for me. And so you push against the grain. They were really nervous about what I was going to say. They were nervous about, in my performance aspect of this installation, how I was going to talk to the public and what I was going to say. So I told them, I'll provide a cultural interpreter. And they said, what is a cultural interpreter? I said, well, it's a white man that would follow me everywhere and inform everything that I'm doing. And they said, that's great. So I pulled my friend in who's from Central Virginia. He's got a little bit of a drawl. He went all out, man. His hair was pulled into a sad little ponytail, and he was wearing glasses, and he was wearing a blazer with pads on the elbows, and I had a name tag made for him, and it said not indigenous, it said Cornelius Smith, and it's a cultural interpreter. And what happened is we turned this into our performance piece. People would come in to the space, and they would ask me a question, and I would give him the answer, and then he would tell them what I just said, except everything he said was wrong. And we did this for the entire show. We went out to the food trucks. I got the wrong meal because we kept doing it. But this is the aesthetic of my work. This is what I do, and this is why I do it. I never ask for permission. I might ask for forgiveness. I can get away with a hell of a lot more if I can ask for forgiveness and not ask for permission. In 1989, that's when I started to change. I was 13, going on 14, going into high school, and I wanted to skateboard, I wanted to snowboard. And you get those skateboard videos and there's music on them. And that's really the first time you're hearing some of this music that coincides with that scene. It's as true now as when I was a kid, maybe even more so. The lyrics that we hear on these songs. You know, in that time, the late 80s, early 90s, for those of you who are alive, there was something happening in our country. Congress was freaking out, and they were trying to create these censorship stickers that they wanted to put on everything, and they had a whole congressional meeting about it. And they invited a number of recording artists to come and to talk about this, to talk about, you know, their work and whether or not it was appropriate. One of the people they invited was Dee Snider. He's a lead singer of Twisted Sister. He basically dressed like a woman and saying, we're not going to take it, which, incidentally, the New York Dolls did about 10 years before that. And everybody was so concerned. They were concerned about the sexualization that was in the music, the violence that was coming up in the music. All they cared about was sex and violence. Maybe the Exploited had it right. When I was doing that video, my wife was like, what are you doing? I'm an Indigenous person, or in a language that you understand, I'm an Indian, Native American, American Indian, First People, First Nation, an Indigenous person of the North American continent. You know, none of these words mean anything. I mean, I know that I'm saying a word and you understand what I'm saying, but these words don't mean anything. I'm Numu. I am Kiwiui Tikata. I'm a member of the Pyramid Lake Paiute Tribe, and even that word Paiute is made up. We have words for ourselves. Numu means the people. A lot of other tribes have words that mean human being. But in this language that you need to understand are all these other words. And I'm telling you that they don't mean anything. This is my opinion, but I don't think they mean anything. They're words that have been created to lump an entire continent of people into one group and to leave them there dehumanized. You know, the first racial slur I ever heard was the word prairie nigger. I was 6 years old when I heard it. That was the day that I knew I was an Indian. That was the day that I was an Indian. These are the truths of Native kids that even now, in 2020, we're still broken down into fractions and into the perception of others. That even as we try to assert our own identity, we're often told that we can't assert our own identity. That there are fans of teams that use racial slurs and stereotypical images to define who we are, that say, we love our Indians, we're celebrating you, we're carrying your legacy. And the moment an Indian comes by and says, maybe that's a little inappropriate, they're like, shut up. This is the world that we live in. That only in a country this twisted could the original inhabitants of this land be mistaken for foreigners. And this is where we live. I don't know this, well, I know this now, but I didn't know it when I was a kid. These are things I had to learn. These are things that many of our children have to learn along the way. This information is important because not only do you have to sometimes articulate these things to people and explain things to people, not only do you have to be the Indian in the room, oftentimes you have to be the expert in the room. And could you imagine growing up and learning this information? Could you imagine growing up and learning this information with the understanding that you would have to use it as a tool for survival? Could you imagine that?
I want to be stereotyped. I want to be classified. I want to be stereotyped. I want to be classified. I want to be alone. I want to some of it home.
My wife and I have been married for 21 years in May, which feels like a pretty big feat. We've got 5 children, and she has the worst taste in music, like the worst taste in music. I mean, she heard some of the same music I did growing up. Her mom was a faux hippie. I say faux hippie because she's a boomer who voted for Trump, and that's not really the whole hippie mentality. My wife's taste in music, we had a conversation about this yesterday because one of her favorite songs is Milli Vanilli, Girl, You Know It's True. And she's like, well, that's not really one of my favorites. Like, I understand that. I'm like, you get so excited when that song comes on. And she starts dancing, and it's really funny, and it's really sweet. But we just don't have the same taste in music. When my wife is looking at me in this way, I don't even think she realized what she's getting into. She tells me that I'm a snob, and she's not wrong, a music snob. But the game is afoot, because we have these 5 children. These 5 children, they uphold their mother. They honor their mother. I want them to honor their mother. She is a strong woman in their lives. A good example for my girls, an even better example for my boys. That these are the women that carry us. These are the women that support us, that stand behind us, that make the world a better place. And I love my wife. She's my everything. I would not be standing here without her. She's home right now watching our children so that I can do my work. And I am forever grateful. But I will be damned if I'm going to let my kids rock their heads to Nickelback. It's not going to happen. So last summer, I took my oldest, Sage, to her first show. It was the Misfits. And it was fantastic. In 1993, one of my best friends, his name was Coleman, and we liked the same things, and he kind of helped introduce me to a lot of other things. We used to hang out, and we used to skate, and I'd stay over at his house. I always felt really comfortable, and they lived in a really nice house in a really nice part of town. And we'd watch OMTV Raps, and then we would stay up late and watch Headbangers Ball. And we went to my first concert, Public Enemy. I'd like to emphasize Public Enemy playing in Salt Lake City, the whitest place on earth. It was pretty incredible. And we were friends. We were good friends. He was one of my good friends. But you know, like friends do, you start to drift apart a little bit. He was making other friends. He was becoming popular among most of the guys that were like hardcore guys, straight edge guys, punk guys. And on this one day, it was in April, he came by my work. I worked at this pizza place and I did everything. I was 17 and he would have been 16. And he came by and he was trying to convince me to leave work and to go with him to see Rage Against the Machine. And 1993, I mean, Rage Against the Machine is a brand new band. You know, only a few people really know who they are. And I just feel this overwhelming sense of responsibility. And I'm like, no. Like, I got to stay here. I'm working. He's like, oh, man. He's like, I really wish you could go. You know, we really miss you. And I was like, oh, thanks for coming by. And then he left. And that was the last time I saw him alive. Coleman had a heart condition. And at the show, he had a heart attack and he died. You know, the time and place when I was 17, you're just in a different place, you know? A mutual friend of mine called me and she said, are you sitting down? Sounds really dramatic, like in the movies, right? And I said, yeah. And she goes, Coleman died. And I said, okay. And she's like, he was at Rage Against the Machine last night, and he had a heart attack, and he died. And I said, okay. And I hung up the phone, and I didn't cry. I wasn't upset outwardly, maybe shocked. I told my mom, she cried. She knew Coleman. And I didn't really know what to do. It was shocking. Losing when you're at that age, when you're a young person, is always tough because it's really hard to cycle that stuff. And when I look back on that now, I think that there's actually a lot of pain. I didn't know how to deal with it, nor did I have the devices to be able to deal with it. But I can tell you, Rage Against the Machine doesn't really sound the same anymore. So, before Rage Against the Machine, Zach De La Rocha was in this band called Inside Out. And it's like an old hardcore band from California. And they broke up before Rage Against the Machine, but they had a reunion show in Salt Lake City. Salt Lake City had this really strangely good scene for music. The straight edge movement really took hold there. For those of you who are not familiar, it's basically a group of punk kids that were sick of drinking and sick of their friends dying and having overdoses and things like that, and they just went straight. They didn't drink, they didn't do drugs. Some of them became vegans. Some of them became abstinent. At all costs, it was about clean living. There's a Minor Threat song about that called Straight Edge. And all I can surmise is that there's these like oppressed white suburban Mormon kids that just were like, yeah, that makes sense. And we'd go to shows and, you'd kick ass. That's just what you did. And I remember Inside Out was doing this reunion show and everybody was excited about it. And so we were all going to go, a bunch of friends. And I know who Inside Out is, but, this is in the age where there isn't Spotify or YouTube or anything else. So really you only know what you own. And I didn't own a record Inside Out. I knew about it. I knew a couple of songs. There's one song called Spiritual Surrender. And I was just excited. There was a buzz. So we go to the show. And it's at this little club called Club Deviate. And this is in 1993. And I actually found a video of that show. And I could see the back of my head in that video from 1993, which is a trip. YouTube wouldn't let me download it. But I go to the show, and there's a couple songs playing, so you're getting amped up, you're getting excited, and you're trying to work up the guts. You can't get up on the stage because there's these two big goons on each side of the stage that look like they'll just pummel the hell out of you. And so they're just like in the pit, and you're just running into each other. There's just different bodies going on. Sometimes you can get up on the crowd as though you stage dive, and the crowd will carry you a little bit. And I did that. And went out, and then the crowd started bringing me back to the stage. I was on my back. If I sat upright, my back would have been facing the stage. But I was on my back. And Zach hits this chorus part of the song. And as he does the chorus, he reaches down and does this. Right in my face. And I did not know the words to that song. I mumbled something. He looked visibly disappointed. I know it was like milliseconds that this happened. But I also remember being embarrassed and kind of dejected, and I went down, and all my friends were like, man, that was so cool, that was so awesome. I was like, no, it wasn't that cool or awesome, because I'm basically an ass. And so, yeah, and I remember that happening, and I remember going out and buying one of their records immediately so that I wouldn't have to have that experience again. When I was 17 years old, I was doing very badly in school. I like to just draw and do art and go to shows and work and buy records. And I wasn't really focused. I wasn't really driven to do anything. About halfway through the time I was 17, my dad started charging me rent. He's like, clearly you don't care. You got to pay your way to be here. So I did. And right around the same time that Coleman died, my father had been talking to his brother in Tennessee and had convinced his brother that I should go out and live with him. My father was legitimately sick of me. He wanted me out of the house. because of everything that happened with Coleman, I left. I wanted to leave. I packed my bags and I left. You know, when I was 16, my dad, he gifted me for my birthday an Army duffel bag and a portable stereo, and he said, "You're going to need this." I didn't know what he meant, but it was that portable stereo and that duffel bag that I took with me on a Greyhound, and I went across the country to every city we hit. Was like the worst part of town. An adventure, not one that I think I would put my 17-year-old through. And I went to Tennessee and got a job and started going back to school, and I actually did pretty well. But my uncle didn't really like me, and he started charging me rent, so much rent that I had to quit. I dropped out of school so that I could pay his rent. I was there for 6 months, and then he was like, "It's time for you to go." I'd like to think that it was him, but it might have been also me. And I went back home. I went back into my father's house. At this point, I'm 18 years old. And my dad said, "Here's the deal. You need to get a job. You need to get your license." I lived in a small town. There's free transit. I didn't have a license because I didn't need it. And I had friends who could drive. And you need to get a car. And then we need to start working on you getting your GED. And I was like, yeah, okay. So I got a job. I got my old job, same pizza place. And I got my license. And my dad was a car mechanic, and so he arranged for me to get a car. In ski resort towns, there's these, what they call ski bums that come through. And they buy a car, and then when the season's over, they abandon the car with the title in the seat. And so they always took it to my dad's mechanic shop, so he'd like have these free cars. I had a Country Squire, Ford Country Squire. It looked like the Griswold family vehicle. It had wood panels on the side, but it had a V8 engine in it. It was a beast. For a station wagon, it was a beast. One of the weekends, I was able to get away with some friends, and I went and I got my first tattoo. Again, we were in a pretty staunch Christian household, so you're not supposed to do that. It was on a Sunday. I was sitting on the floor, and I had my hands up behind my head watching TV. My mom, we had this big L-shaped couch. My mom sat on one end. My dad sat on the other, and my sleeve fell down because it was right about here. And my mom goes, "What's that on your arm?" And I said, "Nothing. She goes, "Is that a tattoo?" Yeah. She's like, "Let me see it." So I showed her, and she looked really disappointed, which at this point in time, I mean, both my parents always looked disappointed. And my dad goes, "Let me see it." And I go over to him and I show him, and he goes, "Son, are you just stupid, or do you just not give a shit?" And I said, "I mean, is there a third choice? I feel like there's got to be a third choice." My sarcasm comes from my dad and my mom, but he was not not a fan of it when I did it to him. And he said, "Pack your stuff. I want you out by Friday." And it was a Sunday. And so I left, and I never went back. It was understood very quickly, and he made it very clear that I was not welcome back for anything more than a visit. And that's just the way that it was.
Some days we look back and laugh.
I've had a lot of music in my life. Had an opportunity to listen to a lot of music in my life. But I was thinking about this. I have a friend who runs a podcast who's also a musician. in California, and she runs this podcast called Orange Juice for the Ears. And she asks these questions like, what was the first song that made an impression? What was the first song that you connected to? You know, things like that. And I was thinking about her questions, and I was thinking about this one, like, what's the first song that you heard that, like, you really heard? The first song that you heard. To me, it was this song by Rollins Band called Low Self-Opinion. And the reason why I connected to it was, first and foremost, Henry Rollins is just a badass, and he was the front man for Black Flag during their greatest years. And, you know, his music was emotional. Rollins Band was emotional. It doesn't sound emotional. Well, it sounds angry. I suppose that's an emotion. But it was the first time I heard something that I was like, yeah, I think I see that in some people. And of course, you get older, I'm like, yeah, I think I see something in myself about that. Because it exudes emotion. It exudes all of the different emotions that we have and how we deal with that and how we hurt people and how we navigate these things appropriately and inappropriately. And it just was mind-blowing to me that these things existed in this way. And it was an incredible song. I still think it's an incredible song. A few years ago, my wife, she was telling me that her mom wanted to buy me something for my birthday. And I was like, I don't know. She doesn't have to get me anything. I'm like an adult man. I don't need presents all the time for my birthday. And she's like, well, you were talking about a turntable. And I was like, yeah. And she's like, well, you should just get the turntable. And when she said that, well, it's kind of amazing because it's like it's a frivolous thing, or it feels like a frivolous thing. And my wife is not particularly a frivolous person. And so I was like, okay. But in my head, there was this existential crisis. I'm in my 40s. And I began to realize that I was scared of a turntable. Not the turntable itself, but sort of the representation of the turntable. See, my dad kicked me out when I was 17. From the time I was 17 until the time I got married when I was 24, I moved 25 times. There was no permanence in my life during that time. There was nothing I could count on. And even when we got married, my wife did very well right out of college. We bought a house a year after we got married. And we lived in that house for almost 15 years. And even then, I just didn't feel a sense of permanence. I never really had that. And I began to realize, I mean, I'm old enough and been through enough stuff that I can kind of see some tells. I can see some triggers. I know what's happening. And I started kind of freaking out because what if I have to move? And what if, like, what if we don't have enough money? I mean, buy a turntable, I can only buy 2 records. That's kind of stupid. And, if I don't have enough money to buy records, and I can't really have a collection, and so, like, what's the point of getting a turntable if I can't have a collection? And I'm just spiraling. My wife's just like, stop, just get the turntable. And I got it. I got a couple records, too. And it was strange. It was strange because the process of taking a vinyl record out of its sleeve and, placing it onto the turntable and gently putting the arm on there, and you hear the crackling. And then you start to hear the music. And it was something I hadn't heard since I was a kid. And I realized that it was like cathartic. I could let go. I mean, like, I'm in my 40s. I got 5 kids. My wife had been married for a while, and, everything's okay. Everything's going to be okay. The first real purchase I made after I got the turntable was a record by a band called the Circle Jerks. The album's called Group Sex. It was something that I hid from my family because I think they would have been very upset if I had a album by a band called the Circle Jerks and album called Group Sex. My wife she was like, do you know what a circle jerk is? I said, yeah. It's a band.
Wild! 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 Wild in the streets! Wild in the streets! Wild in the streets! Wild in the streets! In the heat of the summer that I call out a plumber, turn on the steam car, cool me up with your big club fighters and your newspaper writers, still need a drugstore to kill my buzz.
I feel like I have to come back to my dad. Fathers and sons always have a relationship. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's tough. My dad and I had a tough relationship. We didn't talk a lot when I was a kid. He fixed cars on Saturdays sometimes and just make a little extra cash. And he'd ask me to come out and help him. And I basically just hand him tools and we didn't talk. He talked to me when I handed him the wrong tool. Usually wasn't talking. But my dad, he was a hard man. He was always a hard man. I think he had a tough time because he was so young when I was born, and I think he wanted things, and he wasn't able to really get them. And I think I reminded him so much of himself that it just pissed him off. Just a reminder, a walking reminder. My dad was a musician. He was one of these musicians that could hear something once and play it on a guitar perfectly. I remember the last time I picked up his guitar and I strummed it and it was completely out of tune. I was like, Dad, like, what's up with your guitar? And he took it from me and he just sat and he picked it. And it was amazing because he couldn't read sheet music, but he just knew the guitar was incredible. He also didn't teach me anything. He didn't have any patience. This went on for a long time, my dad and I. We didn't get along for a long time. And it was always frustrating to me. When I had kids, I was like, hey, what are my kids going to call you? Because it's not like you're in their life. I mean, they just call you Gene. And he said, I want them to call me grandfather because my father was, above all else, pretentious. Grandfather. I told them just because he told me that, my kids were going to call him Pappy. It took a long time for the two of us to really come together, and it wasn't until my late 30s that we started really figuring some stuff out. Started realizing that I'm my father's son, that I'm just like him. And he could just as easily stand up here and tell you these stories in front of a group of strangers as I can. That was a talent that he had. There was a lot of love and there was a lot of hate. He used to tell me, because my father's white, My mom is Native, and he used to say when I was kind of gaining ground with my artistic career, and he'd say, "Son, how come you don't ever tell anybody that you're half white?" I said, "Well, Dad, it never comes up." He's like, "But you always tell people like you're a member of the Pyramid Lake Paiute, but you never tell them that you're white." I said, "Dad, I've been Indian my whole life. It doesn't come up. I'm treated like a Native person because I look like a Native person, and that's just the way that it is." And he goes, "Well, I feel like you're ashamed." I'm like, "Dad, I'm not ashamed of being white. You're my father. I love you. Of course I'm not ashamed." And he's like, "Well, I think you should tell people that you're white." I said, "Well, Dad, listen. I speak English, and I wear Western clothes, and I live in a Western house. I don't know how much more white you want me to be." And he's like, "Fair enough." This was how we were able to work through some of these things and having these conversations. And I remember this one night, he came out, he was in DC, and it was kind of a cool evening. We went to dinner, and then we were talking. I don't remember how it came up, but we started talking about stuff. We started talking about when he kicked me out. And we started talking about the troubles that we had as a kid. And he listened to me, and I listened to him. And we were good. Like, we were able to sort of reconcile, you know? And shortly after that, he was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. And he used to call me. He'd get the infusions, which is really, really difficult. And he would call me so he could tell me about something that really pissed him off that some nurse did, because he knew I'd be like, "Oh man, that would totally piss me off too." And we started becoming close and talking all the time. I went out and I visited my dad just before he passed away. And I'd never seen my father cry his entire life. But as I was about to leave, we hugged. And he was crying, and I was crying. The last words I said to him were, "You're the most important man in my life." And I never saw him alive again after that. Recently, I was in a record store, and occasionally, like a lot of record store guys, I just spend hours going through the bins, just finding stuff. And I oftentimes have an agenda, but my dad had this incredible vinyl collection, all of his work. I think I just convinced my sister to let me have it, because she has it. I was going through some bins, and I saw something familiar. This is Crosby, Stills, and Nash and Young, So Far. I was like, "Hey, I remember that." And I picked it up, I bought it. It was $7. Price tag's still on it. And I took it home, and I put it on the turntable, and I played it. Oh my gosh, it was like just like hitting a brick wall. Because when my father passed, I was sad, but I felt like that we had reconciled so much. So I was sad, I cried, I miss my dad. I miss the things that we could have done, the things that we used to do. But gosh, hearing that just about bowled me over. But it's not just the song and reminding me of him, it's also the voice behind the song. It's protest music. It's still relevant today. It's beautiful. It's incredible. I find it really ironic that protest music has such an impact on me as a kid, and then I stand here before you doing all the things that I'm doing. It's kind of crazy. I miss my dad.
Find the cost of freedom buried in the ground. Mother Earth will swallow you. Lay your body down. Find the cost of freedom buried in the ground. Mother Earth will swallow you. Lay your body down.
This is what I've been working on for the last year. I have appropriated or reappropriated old comic book images from the 40s and 50s of Indians, specifically from this comic book that was drawn by the same artist that did Conan the Barbarian, but his longest running series was a series called White Indian, and it's exactly what you think it is. It is a white man that is more Indian than the most Indian that was ever Indian, and it's incredible. But in the spirit of appropriation, because I am an American and I know how to appropriate, I reappropriate this work and have reappropriated it for my purposes. And I've changed all of the dialogue to be lyrics from songs. I got something to say. I killed your baby today. It doesn't matter much to me as long as it's dead. Sweet, lovely death, I'm waiting for your breath. Come, sweet death, one last caress. It's a Misfits song called Last Caress. And when I break up the lyrics and I assign them to different people, it makes sense. It resonates. I mean, this isn't historically true, but it could be. This is by a song called DOA, called That's Progress. It says, you're evicted, time to leave. Doesn't matter if your family's been here 30 years. It's a song about gentrification. Now, make no mistake, gentrification and Indian removal are not the same thing, but it uses a lot of the same language. I'm an antichrist. I'm an anarchist. I don't know what I want, but I know how to get it. That's a Sex Pistols song, Anarchy in the UK. And I don't really look at it like antichrist, like a Satan worshiper. It's more like an anti-Christian industrial complex. I don't look at anarchy as complete chaos, but I look at it more like anti-power structures. Those power structures that might tell you you can't talk about the Washington Redskins. This is where I'm at. This is what I've been doing, right? So I've been making a record collection. I've been buying records. I bought the Circle Jerks Group Sex album. I have it right here. I bought a first pressing of that and a first pressing of End of Silence, Rollins Band. And all of these things are pointing towards something that I think it's a bit of a revelation to me. Can this music that to many people is not really listenable, can it be healing? Can it heal us? Can we connect with punk music, with riot music, with angry music, with protest music? And can those pieces of music heal us? Because I can tell you that sense of permanence that I had and the struggle that I had with that has been bridged by all this music, by collecting records, by being a music snob, as my wife says. One of the things I really wanted to buy was this. I love Black Flag. This is their first 7-inch. It's called Nervous Breakdown. It's actually a 9th pressing because the first pressing is about $1,200, and I still need to convince my wife that that's worth it. But it's this little 7-inch record. And even still today, when I hear Nervous Breakdown, as sung by Glenn Morris, who incidentally is the lead singer of the Circle Jerks. He was the lead singer of Black Flag before Henry Rollins came along. But when I hear this song, Nervous Breakdown, it makes sense to me. It still makes sense to me. This work that I just showed you a few of, I've been working on it for a year. I have yet to show it publicly. I put it on my Instagram, that's about it. And I had a show set up in DC and it got canceled. And then I had another show set up in DC with another place and it fell through. And I had a place in Denver set up and it fell through. And I remember when that last one fell through, I was so mad. So mad that I've been working on this. I've had great responses to it. I've got actors and musicians that are like famous and they're buying it up. It's awesome and I love it and I still have yet to show it beyond just a flat image. And I was listening to a punk mix that I have. It's called the greatest punk mix of all time. Because I too am pretentious like my father. And this song came on. And I remember hearing it. And I remember thinking, yeah, that totally makes sense. So now you have to listen to it. But before I make you listen to it, I want to say one more thing. There are Indigenous people in the future. One last thing. There's probably never been a room this still when that song has played ever. Thank you guys for coming out.